Are you guys ready?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick introduction. So Shamika first. Shamika grew up in San Antonio and was blessed to obtain an interdisciplinary degree with humanities from Stanford. After moving to New York initially to serve with the Corps, she received a Master's of Divinity at Union Theological Seminary in New York with a concentration in technology and ethics. Shamika decided to pursue a career combining service and technology, so she completed an online full-stack web development boot camp, which is an experience. She is a tech chaplain who works to empower people and places of faith around technology. And she is, as you can probably see in her background, she helps out. She is a technology instructing assistant at a school in New York City. Mm-hmm. Kenji is a writer and the author of a booklet of uncommon prayer, collects for the Black Lives Matter movement and beyond. Kenji is an MDiv student at McCormick Theological Seminary and a Master of Social Work candidate at University of Chicago, which I believe is a new addition to your schooling there, the MSW. He serves on the boards of the Reformation Project and the Japanese American Citizens League. So both of them are returning eFormation presenters. So both of them have presented in person, and we are excited to welcome them back to the eFormation learning community. So Shamika and Kenji, thank you so much for being with us today, and we are excited to learn from you and with you.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, we're really excited. We'll be with you for the next hour or so, and then as Sarah mentioned, we'll have affinity group time afterwards too. So if we don't get to all the conversations, we're really looking forward to being able to join you all there too. So today we're going to be talking about, the title for our presentation is From Gutenberg to Google, Figuring Out How to Make the Church Tech Again. And we're going to give a brief overview before we get started. Think of this as in kind of like 5 parts. We're going to start by giving some opening primers on examples of tech disrupting the church in the 21st century and in today's atmosphere. Then we're going to move and give a little bit of context on the church and tech, giving a timeline and also some orienting remarks on virtual theology and just a little bit of gristle to help us prepare for the conversation. Mm-hmm. The meat of what we're getting into a little bit later, we're calling techno-theological quandaries. These are kind of like case examples of times when ethics and faith can collide. And then we'll just turn to some closing thoughts and Q&A. So this is kind of an overview of our time together today. And Sarah gave us a great introduction, but we thought we'd do another quick one.
Yes. So as you all heard, I'm from San Antonio, Texas. I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and I was the kid that went to math camp and engineering camp for fun in school, and really had a passion for those things, but didn't end up studying it in college. So it wasn't until going to seminary where I was discerning how to continue serving people, which I had started doing in AmeriCorps. And when a bunch of people started coming to me asking for help setting up their devices and their Google apps and all of these things, I ended up starting to work with the IT department, and from there came up with the concept of tech chaplaincy, which combines the best practices of pastoral care and chaplaincy with tech support. So that's how I entered into the conversation, and I realized very quickly that there's not a lot of people in the space at the intersection of technology and ethics and thinking critically and theologically about how we use technology and how we create it. And so that's why I'm excited about our conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you, Shamika. As for myself, just a quick introduction. This is a picture of me, my name, and a Twitter handle. I'm from the Chicagoland area originally. I have a background in social work and theology kind of things. And I'm really interested in this question of how technology and ethics relate, and how tech not only kind of amplifies who we are, or is not only the medium of things, but also like itself is shaping us and changes us. And that's super exciting for me to learn about with all of you. And we both really enjoyed putting this presentation together today. So I hope that it's a pleasant experience.
Yes. So,
as I said, we're going to open by talking about a few examples of ways that we say tech is pushing the sacred envelope. And we have Clippy here on this slide to encourage you to jot down any feelings, thoughts, reactions, concerns, maybe just type them out, and then you can even dump them in the chat thread, and we'll kind of have the time to share a little bit about those after these examples. But these are now just some orienting primers on ways that tech is disrupting or challenging the way that we think church works.
Exactly. And so the first one here is a robot priest, and we have a little bit of a clip to show you this priest in action.
Funeral robot priests are ready for hire in Japan. A Japanese company has decided to totally take the life out of funerals by using SoftBank's humanoid robot Pepper as a Buddhist priest for funerals that you can hire.
Ooh.
With the help of some software upgrades, Pepper can now chant sutras in a robot voice while tapping on a drum. The priest bot was on display at a funeral trade show in Tokyo on Wednesday. The robot provides a cheaper alternative than getting a human priest. Old school priests will run you around $2,200, while Pepper only costs around $450 per funeral. Pepper can be outfitted in different robes depending on the wishes of the customers. They can also live stream the ceremony to people who aren't able to attend the funeral in person. Pepper hasn't been hired yet, but maybe if you're planning on dying soon and happen to be in Japan, this may be just the service for you.
So that's one example. We have another example, not from Japan, but from Germany.
Herzlich willkommen. Möchten Sie von einer weiblichen oder einer männlichen Stimme gesegnet werden? Gerne. Welchen Segen brauchen Sie? Gott segne dich und behüte dich. Lasse sein Angesicht leuchten über dir und sei dir gnädig. Gott erhebe sein Angesicht auf dich und schenke dir seinen Frieden.
Yes, they are. They are serious.
Geh in Frieden, Gott. Danke für Ihren Besuch und auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Indeed, and there's a quote from one of the creators from the German robot project saying, "We wanted people to consider if it is possible to be blessed by a machine or if a human being is needed. We don't want to roboticize our church work, but see if we can bring a theological perspective to a machine."
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, so that's one of the things we want us to think about. As another, this was an interesting example. Just as an orienting remark, the host and the drone. This is a clip from a church in Brazil. The parish received some criticism from the institutional church and the archdiocese, but this is the clip.
There's the ascension, like you said. It's manna. Yeah, it's bread from heaven.
Just for some context, that was a drone bringing the Blessed Sacrament into a Catholic parish. These chats are so funny. I'm deeply amused.
Y'all are on it. I love it. And then the last example here, you may have heard of Tupac and Michael Jackson performing posthumously, and that was done through holograms. But what about if there was a Billy hologram? If there was a preacher who is, and this is happening, like in this image, there's satellite churches where the pastor or the preacher will project themselves onto the stage and present the sermon. And that is the holographic homiletics that's happening out on the streets.
We don't have a clip for this one, but just imagine it.
Yes, yes.
So we wanted to check in just after looking at a few of those examples, and I see there's already been some conversation in the thread. What feelings are coming up looking at these? What disturbed, excited, surprised, or challenged you? We would love to see some chat responses, and we'll kind of read them out. And then if you have other examples of how you've seen the sacred and the technological mixing in an innovative way, we would be really interested in hearing about that too. So we'll just take a few minutes.
Yes, and I see already Karen has made the really great question of where's the human connection in all of this, or how just human connection, question mark.
Right.
And then Millard says people are looking for something that they're not getting elsewhere. What is it? Medora says for them, the mechanics get in the way of the human, even divine relationship. Very interesting point. And maybe we have one more. Someone else want to share out?
These are so fun. I love these chats. Wow, this is so cool.
And then Lisa says, find myself feeling something between very old and extraterrestrial. Okay, so thank you all for your comments and your feedback there. And as we continue to present, please feel free to use that space as a space to react to what we're presenting. So moving forward, the the next thing we want to talk about is this notion of virtual theology. Some of you might have even seen this image before, but you may be well aware of Ecclesiastes 1:9. There's nothing new under the sun, where we had people in the time of the horse and buggy lined up reading newspapers. We now have people in front of a train on their cell phones. And when we think about the examples that we've presented and the examples that we're going to be talking about later on, it's important to know that there is nothing new, that humans have been interacting with and engaging with various kinds of technologies. I define technology as anything that solves a problem. So engaging with these things from time memorial. And what's interesting is when writing, for example, first became prevalent in the Greek culture, Socrates told his students that it was a waste of time and it would be horrible for the intellect, because at the time, of course, in rhetoric, you memorized everything, all of your speeches, all of your arguments, all of the information that you were using. And so this newfangled technology was going to ruin all of that by writing things down. And since then, there's been this trend of having antagonism, fear, critique, anxiety around the new developments that occur, the innovations that happen. And not that that's wrong or bad or anything, but that dynamic has always been there. There's been people who are excited about it and push for it, and then there's people who are very reserved and concerned about it. But as people of faith, it's good to remember that the most used phrase in the Bible is fear not. And when it comes to things like technology, we have not been given a spirit of fear and timidity. So, and I thought it was interesting when someone said before about the machine or the technology getting in the way of the human or divine relationship. I would say right now we are all fellowshipping in a way, and even though we're separated by space, we're collected and gathered in this one time. And so I'm reminded of Matthew 18:20, where 2 or 3 are gathered, I am there with you. So I believe that whether we're gathered digitally or in analog meet space, so to speak, it's going to be the same thing, that God is going to be there in the midst. we can move forward, and we're going to imagine this bell curve here is the representation of technology adoption. So imagine the church's experience with technology. You may think that the church has been a laggard and has been since the Gutenberg Bible, if you will. We even have a quote that Jim Keats gave at an eFormation conference that we'll show here. The printing of the Bible on the printing press was the one time that the church was at the forefront of cultural communication technology. But we'll show in our timeline that we're going to do here that that's not necessarily the case.
Whoops, I was muted.
There you go.
Thanks. That's a great setup. Thank you. So just as a brief introduction to a very compressed timeline of the church and technology, we wanted to give a framework for how we've seen the church engaging with issues of tech. And, you know, just to go back for a second to this quote that Shamika introduced around the Bible and the printing press, this is, we're trying to draw this instance into conversation with the 21st century and more recent tech trends as well. So if we start the timeline with the Gutenberg Bible, just as a really primary example of a time that the church utilized a new piece of technology, this was during the 1450s. And the ability to mass produce scripture and to put it into the hands of much more people was an absolute watershed moment in the history of the world, of Europe, and the history of the church. And we also point to the Luther Bible as a sort of second chapter of that story. So Luther's Bible became very well known for putting the scriptures in the hands of the vernacular, the common people. So Luther translated the Bible into common German. He was not the first scholar to do so, but he was the first to use the original Greek and Hebrew texts rather than the Latin Vulgate. And so his translation was not clunky. There were not glitches. It was much more smooth. It was accessible. It was readable, and it was in the common tongue. And these stuck out as two sort of revolutionary and transcendent moments that would have very important implications for the church. If we jump way down the line, obviously skipping over many other important moments in a timeline here. In the 1920s, we have examples of radio preachers who, in fact, oh, I had her name right here.
Amy
Semple McPherson,
yeah.
is that it?
Yeah.
Who is called the first celebrity preacher of the modern era. Started using radio to preach in the 1920s and was able to deliver messages to many people in a manner reminiscent to earlier days, such as the printing press. And we felt like the advent of radio preaching was really another kind of watershed moment for the 20th century church, and globalizing the message. And let me just jump back here for a second. If we look at this sort of bell curve again of when people adapt technologies or don't, this was case in point at the time of radio preaching. You had some Christians who thought that it was an inappropriate way of spreading the gospel, of witnessing to their faith, and others who jumped on board very early and took advantage of these nascent forms of communication. We know that Billy Graham's legacy is very large. It's often obscure that he really became first well known by pioneering preaching over television. So this is, again, in the 1950s now, a newer nascent form of technology that was viewed with great suspicion by many religious folks. But Billy Graham was one of the first religious leaders who used this new technology to reach millions. And I mean, we question too, beyond simply amplifying the message, how did these forms of technology, whether the written text, the audio or the visual, how do these also shape what message was being preached?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and as we move through the timeline, what's interesting is once we enter the information age, there's a similar trajectory of starting with just static written text and then things becoming more multimedia as time moves forward. So starting with Web 1.0 in the 1990s, the World Wide Web premiered in 1989, and exploded in the mid-1990s. Who here remembers America Online, the little discs, you know, and the Netscape, some of the early browsers that you were using. Those provided a space for people to engage with static websites, forums, and discussion boards. And it was generally a space to share and exchange information and ideas, but that information was mostly textual. So, for example, if there were church websites at the time, you know, you were using something like GeoCities to create a website, there have not been much change in some websites for some churches. I would imagine I could probably still find a church's website on GeoCities somewhere, but in the Web 2.0 era, that was when you had things like YouTube and social media websites like Facebook, MySpace, Friendster, these kinds of things starting to pop up. And the mobile technology that also existed in the zips or the aughts. The iPhone debuted in 2007, and with it the App Store. And so before moving on to apps, just this Web 2.0, being able to be more multimedia, you're able to include imagery, you're able to include video, and you have different faith communities starting to share images of their space on their website, as well as to share sermons. Moving then to the mid 2000s to today, we have streaming live. You have podcasts that became popular and are continuing to grow. And then apps, specifically faith related apps. So some of the ones that we came across, and there's so many more, but there's the UCC app where you can light the candle that's part of their service. There's a Wudu app for Islam that helps show children how to wash up and prepare for Salah. There's a Yoruba app. There's an Ordain Thyself app by Tony Jones. There are lectionary apps and of course, meditation apps. And I would imagine if I took a poll, there'd be a number of us who have the Holy Bible YouVersion or some sort of Bible app on our phones right now.
We just wanted to pause for a second and see if there were things that came up in the chat as reactions to this timeline. I saw that there were some.
Yes.
In prayer is an example of the church and mass messaging.
I think you got a lot of good reactions to the drones and the robot creatures.
Yes.
Yeah.
To think about.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, again, this Karen's comment about connecting humans, not replacing them. I love the quote that Shamika shared of the project creators of the people who made the robot clergy in Germany, and that was their exact comment. We don't want to robotize our church work, but see if we can bring a theological perspective to a machine.
Right.
Love that.
Right. And I mean, just randomly, the word robot is like a Czech word for slave. So, you know, God came to free the slave, right? So bringing faith to the machines can free them. I don't know.
I think there's a Futurama episode about that.
I believe it. I believe it. Love Futurama. And
Shamika,
someone else. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say we're doing great on time when we practice this. So we're doing great.
Marvelous. I was going to say Lisa is either Lisa H or Lisa spelled a really beautiful way, commented that there was a Dalla prayer recorded phone messages in the 1960s and 70s. So there's all of this really great history with the church and technology that I think not a lot of people know about. And in my opinion, there seems to be a skewing of use and adoption of technology, especially early adoption in particular faith communities. Those faith communities tend to be evangelical. That's not always the case, but there does seem to be something of a lagging behind in some more progressive liberal spaces, whereas the church that we showed before that had the holographic homiletics, that was, I can't say exactly, the numbers and statistics, but I feel like those theologies that are being used in these new technologies and disruptive technologies, the theologies that are getting out there, maybe aren't always the ones that are on the right side of history, the ones that are the most uplifting and justice oriented and whatnot. So I'm really eager to see that more of those kinds of theologies participate in the use of technology and the engaging of different technologies to reach more people.
I'll talk about this a little later too, but something Shamika has taught me is that technology, she defines it as anything that helps you solve a problem. Right. And in that sense, we give this timeline and this contextualizing to point out something that Lisa observed in the chat thread. This is not entirely new for the church. The forms of tech that we're grappling with, I think we know are new, but this question of how anxieties, concerns, expectations are vaulting and then fall, and all of this. We've been through this kind of thing as a church before, and we wanted to sort of contextualize it and give some background on that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so now we're going to move into techno-theological quandaries. I see there's a couple of comments and a question that we will come back to. Millard's question about one call versus constant contact, I see you. And then the comments from Melinda and Karen we'll speak to. But moving forward through the presentation here, we're going to start with these. We're going to have three different sort of things that we're going to look at. And the first of which I mentioned before, many of us here probably have a Bible app on our phones. Some of us may even have a Quran on our phone. Or you certainly know someone who has put a Quran on their cell phone or their iPad or something along that line. But what happens when you're using a Quran on a digital device that you then can take into a restroom? Someone had to consider what happens and how to comport oneself in that situation. And this is an example of a quandary we just want to give you an insight into.
So we'll just roll this clip and then we'll kind of contextualize a little more afterwards too.
The volume seems really low.
Ooh, is that? Let me know if you can't hear it. Yeah, it's hard to hear, isn't it?
It is. And there's a way, I remember Sarah was showing us during the setup for you to share your screen and use the audio on your computer.
This is tech chaplaincy in action.
So, yes, when you went to share your screen, there was an option in the bottom left for audio. So that's the one that we want here.
Good job.
So, yes. So if you stop sharing your screen and then go to share it again.
Stop share. Share.
On the bottom left, you should see more options, and one of them is about audio.
Audio options.
And while you're doing that, Lindsay has this really great comment about searching for a church a few years ago, found some of the best looking church websites, also included some of the most toxic theology on their beliefs page.
Oh,
really
got
great
it.
point. Progressive folks have got to get better with tech and make sure their message is heard. I completely agree.
Isn't that so true?
Oh my gosh.
They have the best graphics, design, video.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think about how they say like someone's first visit to your church will likely be through your website.
Yes.
That's so true, Lindsay.
Yes.
I think I figured out this sound thing.
Oh, great. Okay, let's try it and see.
We'll come back to this conversation too. Let's see if this works.
Know that there are rules about reading the Quran. That is, we should be in the state of wudu before touching the book. How does this rule apply to electronic devices? I usually read the Quran on my phone or laptop. Also, should we be in wudu if we only recite from memory, not touching or reading? I'll begin with your second question. You do not need to be in the state of wudu when you read the Quran or recite it from memory. And a lot of the sisters, especially from the subcontinent, they come and say, when we recite the Quran, do we have to wear our hijab? Do we have to cover our hair? When we hear the adhan, is it must that we wear the hijab? And all of this is baseless. These are baseless things. You, in your house, are not obliged at all to cover your head when hearing the adhan or when reciting the Quran at all. So this is baseless. One would say, oh, it's best that I do it. No, it's not. Because now you're innovating. Now you're bringing something to the deen that is not part of it. As for reciting the Quran and touching the PDAs or the mobile phones or the laptops to read the Quran from it, you do not require wudu for that. Why? Because these characters, these letters, these words, they are digital. So once you turn them off, they're gone. They are not like the actual Quran, which is written on paper. And this requires wudu. And this is what the scholars say. Of course, if you perform wudu, would I be...
So just for some context on that clip, wudu is the act of ritual cleansing that is performed by Muslims before prayer or before reading the Quran. And this question of how the Quran may be read on an electronic device, we thought was just like a fantastic and really perfect example from another Abrahamic tradition of contemporary faith leaders who are wrestling with these questions over tech and the sacred and what it means to honor tradition and to be present in new ways with them. So I think Shamika had to step away for 1 second, but we can keep rolling through here. Yeah, let's see. Oops. Excellent. I'm going to come back to this slide because Shamika is going to cover that, but I wanted to start here then. Okay, so this is an eerie clip from Planet of the Apes, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, which is from 1970. And there's this eerie scene where the worshipers give blessings to and pray to a nuclear weapon, an undetonated bomb. And the praise they use is, may the blessing of the bomb almighty and the fellowship of the holy fall descend on us all this day and forevermore. Amen. And we included this because it stands out. And Shamika, I'm just starting with the blessings, and then we can go back to the digital citizenry.
Thank you.
This was like a haunting example of something that that we're wrestling with in the 21st century, and that's the question of blessings. What do we bless? How do we bless it? And this is one of those techno-theological quandaries in the Christian tradition that our church is facing right now. This is a picture from the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which every year holds a bicycle blessing. So they invite motorcyclists and bicyclists to the church and then sprinkle them with holy water, have liturgy, and have a blessing ceremony for the safety of the riders and for the well-working of these bikes. And you know, Shamika's point about technology being anything that helps us solve a problem, for me raises the question of what do we bless, and what are our churches blessing today? So we looked at the example of the Sanctuary Unification Church and their recent blessing of assault rifles of parishioners, where they had members bring these weapons, these technology pieces to church, and receive blessings on them, commending them for their proper use. We felt like this was a primary example of a church today, our church, having to choose between what we bless and what we call holy. Guns, bikes, sticks digging out termites and ants, these are all pieces of technology, and it rests with the church to decide which we will commend to our use and which we will reject.
Mm-hmm.
Should we hop back to your piece now, Shamika?
Yes, and I apologize. Someone came to the door. I had to answer. My coworker stepped out. There is a concept called digital citizenry. As you can see, there's 9 elements of digital citizenry, and it's a concept that was created to help us think about how do we use technology ethically? How do we use it well? And when we have all of these elements together, digital access, digital commerce, digital communication, digital literacy, digital etiquette, digital law, digital rights and responsibilities, digital health and wellness, and then digital security, all of those things, once you have those awarenesses, you can then equip yourself to know how to use technology in a way that is fulfilling, life-giving, rewarding, etc. So taking that into consideration, we then ask the question, what is our responsibility as faith leaders to equip those we care for when it comes to technology? I consider the Holy Scriptures to be a place where we can think about how to answer life's questions. And it's a resource that we can turn to whenever we do have these ethical quandaries, conundrums, dilemmas, etc. So that, I believe, should include what happens when we deal with technology. When there are social justice issues that come up with using or creating technology. For example, when creating technologies, when Google Photos first came out, it was able to sort your pictures and images using machine learning. So the database that they used, the data set that they used of images, somehow got Black people mixed up with gorillas. So you had an engineer whose picture came up and he was labeled as a gorilla. So that creation of technology wasn't very ethical because the data set that they used didn't have a lot of people of color in it to teach the machine how to recognize them. And then, of course, there's tons of examples of people using technology in a way that's not ethical. There's Gamergate, for example, which happened a couple of years ago, where women in tech and women in the gaming industry were being attacked online in places like Twitter. Their websites were being hacked, DDoS attacks, and being swatted, weaponized pornography, all kinds of things. And all this was happening in the digital space. So as people of faith, we can be an example to the world of how to comport oneself using and creating these things and helping people figure out what ways make sense for the ethical use and ethical creation of these devices. Just as God created us and we as creations create, the things that we create are then divine through that line, that lineage. So I believe they are divine and sacred and deserve that level of thought and understanding and attention as well.
Shamika, could you just define swatted, which
yes. So swatting, like with, when the SWAT team is, when you call the police and say something that will get the SWAT team to go to someone's house, such as I have hostages, I have a gun, I just shot someone, something like that. You get the police to SWAT someone's house unbeknownst to them. And there was a time when people were doing this to people who were live streaming on various things like Twitch or YouTube, so that they could watch the SWAT team come in and break down doors, put people up against the wall. Unfortunately, someone has been shot and killed during a swatting, and it was someone very innocent. They saw lights outside, so they went outside to see what was going on, And the police were under the impression that there was a hostage situation happening in the house. Unfortunately, they made several different errors, such as shooting first and asking questions later. And unfortunately, the person who stepped outside was killed by the police. So there are issues that start in the digital space that happen in the analog space, and the virtual violence becomes physical violence. And that's also something that I'm very interested in learning more about and helping stop. And this is something that I think the church can do really well, looking at its history with civil rights, looking at its history with social justice and other arenas.
Yeah. And we'll be thinking about this question too, Shamika, of how tech may embolden or as we were planning this conversation, we were thinking about the plethora examples of just the most insidious parts of human nature utilizing tech in really unfortunate ways. And so I think that's an important conversation piece to keep in mind too. This third sort of techno-theological quandary or question is really related to some of the primers that we started out with. And it's the question of digitizing the sacraments, or what the role of the sacraments is in the digital space. So sacraments, just as a general review, St. Augustine famously described them as the physical outward manifestations of those inward and visible spiritual graces and the gifts from God. And the church has historically named a number of things sacraments, including the Eucharist, baptism, marriage, holy orders, anointing of the sick, confession, confirmation, many others. And so this question of how these sacraments, which we've always understood to be, like Augustine said, these physical manifestations, how they relate to the digital space is really interesting too. A question that we came across in some of the research on this that one pastor had posed is, can the blood of Christ be pixelated? Can one receive communion virtually, digitally by distance? There was a comment from, I think it was Juliet earlier, about how the sacrament could be shared with hard to reach people by some of these means. And I think, while that something in me balks perhaps at the idea that flesh and blood or bread and wine physically being present might be at risk, but we actually came across some really interesting content as we were doing this research. So there's this concept in the Catholic tradition called spiritual communion, which has been established by church tradition as essentially equivalent, and this is one suggested prayer that the Catholic Church produced to it. So if you're not, I'm sorry if my internet's being a little laggy for a moment here. If you're not able to physically receive the Eucharist, you can say this prayer, ask God to give you the Eucharist spiritually, and according to church canons, this is exactly, it is no less meaningful or no less real than physically partaking in communion. And when we were doing some of this research, Shamika remarked that this is an app in a way, and one that has a long history and a long tradition in the church. And so as we're thinking about downloading the divine, or how communion relates to the digital or virtual or distant spaces, we're also thinking about some of the other sacraments. I'll turn to Shamika for some of that.
Yes. So in the digital space, when we create, most of what we're doing there is communicating with other people, with social media spaces, with video games, for example. And when you're interacting with other individuals, those relationships can burgeon into situationships, which can burgeon into love, and people will take that all the way down the aisle to the altar. So there are people who have gotten married in games like Second Life, which is like, so this is our first life. Second Life is where you create an avatar who looks like anything you want it to look like. And then it's a multiverse. So there's all these different universes that you can exist in, and you can have a job, you can get a house, there's a currency, there's people who make their living creating luxury items for your Second Life avatar. and also World of Warcraft, which is one of the more popular MMORPGs, which is multimedia online role-playing game. And so with Second Life, World of Warcraft, those relationships that then get married, those marriages are very real to the individuals in those relationships, and they take vows as sacredly as we would in the analog space. And just as those relationships have their own validity through marriage, there is then the ending of life that happens both in the analog space and then in the digital space. There's social media sites that allow you to, like Facebook's legacy feature, that allows your profile to be a memorial to you. Social media accounts can be configured to continue to post after your demise. There are online websites where you can have more memorials to people. You can put digital flowers or messages on what would be their digital grave site. So this end of life, afterlife sort of space, like how we continue on, it's an opportunity for people to sort of take all of themselves, including their digital self, and grieve the loss of that. And I've heard it said funerals are for the living. But when you take the time to set up your social media accounts for your digital self, that's something that you could do for you. And then of course for the other people who would be consuming that, but that's just something to keep in mind that you have access to in the digital space.
Yeah. So again, this question of digitizing them, or the broader question of how, when, and if God inverts, and if, like me, you've ever prayed for a page to load, or to go clear. The question of how I mean, for example, when it comes to I was kind of phones are normally used, how they're normalized to gather people as weapons, in communion or settings, and we'll have a little bit of time around those if you're able and willing. Again, those three questions are from the digital and sacraments. What is the role of tech and sacramental presence and worship? From and blessings, what is the relations of tech that are beyond the pale and that should not be acceptable in the
Hey, Kenji.
church? And what like
we have a few people saying that the audio is breaking up.
Like,
that's a great idea.
Can you take over and ask the questions that Kenji is asking?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
thank you.
Yes. So Kenji, if you wouldn't mind moving back through those last three slides.
Thank you.
Thank you for calling on that, folks. So the question is, what are the roles of the sacraments in the digital space, or what is the role of digitizing the sacraments? These are questions that you all can respond to in the chat, of course. The next question was about the blessing of the devices, and thinking about what devices will we bless, what pieces of technology will we call holy, and then of course that begs the question, what devices will we not bless, what pieces of technology will we not call holy? And then the first question was about digital citizenry and the role and responsibility of people of faith and faith leaders to equip those we care for in digital citizenry, and being able to know how to use technology, what are the rights and responsibilities of it, how to use it ethically, what kind of decisions can we make in terms of creating and using this technology well. So those are the 3 questions. I already see a few responses. Lindsay says there's a part of her that cringes when she thinks about the idea of digitizing the sacraments, but on the other hand, who is she to say what God is and isn't capable of working through? And I definitely appreciate that sentiment. And it sort of reminds me of how, not that this is your thought process, of course, Lindsay, but I'm thinking about when there was a time that interracial dating and slavery were, slavery was condoned and interracial dating was not in favor, and both of those things were justified by the Bible. And then looking back, it's like, well, of course, that's not the message that was intended from the sacred text, and thinking about how people of faith have been able to use their faith to come to those conclusions. Like what we want to be able to do is find the love and the light and the goodness in these things. And I think leaving space for that and making space for that is a really necessary thing. And then Lisa says there's some powerful reflections, raises
Shamika,
additional.
can I say something to Lindsay's?
Oh, yes, yes, absolutely.
Am I, just this question of spiritual communion, which we were researching, and how the Eucharist was understood to be something that could be downloaded in any place or time in a way that's no less spiritually significant than physically receiving it. You had some pushback from other church leaders in Anglican and in the Catholic Church in the 1500s and beyond, when spiritual communion began becoming popular. And these leaders said, no, it doesn't count, or it counts, but don't do it instead of going to church. So there was kind of still this emphasis on worshiping in the flesh and using this as an alternative, or for folks who were unable to do so. But even that tension was still present at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that. I think it's, again, learning about our history. It's really important to know that these are conversations we've been having and things that we've been wrestling with for a really long time. To Lisa's comment, she's has these powerful reflections and raises additional questions about community in the digital space and relationships between individuals and your neighbor, and experience of sacraments. So I guess if you're experiencing the community, let's say there was an app, because right now, believe it or not, there's an app for everything but Holy Communion. And I'm so ready to make that app. It's not even funny, but until that happens, there's not an app. But if there was, then you don't have to go into a faith community to receive communion. You can get it from your phone. But think about how when the Bible was predominantly kept in Latin, only to be read by the priest, and people just relied on hearing it auditorily. Once it was not digitized, but once it was made available with the Gutenberg Bible and then the Luther Bible, these things opened up and unlocked an aspect of the ritual of church and the aspect of faith to so many more people in a way that drastically changed that understanding of how people and priests related to each other and worked together to do this thing called religion, to do this thing called Christianity. And so if you don't need to go into a church to receive communion, but you can do it from your phone, that's going to be another huge change. That there are people, for example, who have been kicked out of their church for being gay, and they feel like they can't take communion somewhere. Suddenly they have an app on their phone where they can take communion, or they can, maybe there's a Snapchat filter where you can receive ashes on Ash Wednesday, or, something like that. Who knows? If that hasn't been done, we need to do that, Kenji. But this concept of community and digital spaces and relationships between individuals and whatnot in the digital space. I think it's a really good point, Lisa. Did you have something to say there, Kenji?
Hello, sorry about that.
Quite all right. I wanted to give you an opportunity to jump in before I move on to the next comment here.
Are you there?
I'm here.
Kenji is disappeared.
And I don't see, okay, there we go. Okay, so Kenji, feel free to jump in. Lisa H says, I love the spiritual communion in my ministry as a layperson leading a worship service. This is so helpful to know.
Seminary internet. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. There you are. I know the struggle.
I think you are suffering from seminary internet syndrome.
We're almost home.
Yeah.
So go ahead and turn your video off, so then that way we can just hear you. You can use your God voice.
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
It's quite all right. Quite all right.
We're like 2 minutes from being home. Wrapping up here.
Okay.
All right, we still don't see your screen.
Well,
there we go. Perfect.
Okay.
Well, Shamika, you could start and then I could wrap it up while I try to get my signal boosted here.
Okay. Well, I was looking through the last few comments from the last section here, and just want to plug our affinity group because we have a ton more questions that we want to continue the conversation on. So for those of you who are interested, please feel free to join us for the affinity group that will be starting right after this conversation. There'll be much more conversation around some of the things that we've talked about, as well as a few new questions that we didn't have time to fit into the presentation. So it's going to be a great time. I'm just going to say that now. Okay, so I'm going to just jump in here with moving forward and final thoughts. When it comes to technology, as you can see here, we're purportedly a people of immense hope, but that's not always our posture when it comes to technology as faith leaders. This idea of being immensely hopeful and looking forward and being excited and open to the possibilities.
Right. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Yes, I see a nod. Okay. Yeah, we just wanted to highlight what we perceive as some incongruity between the hope to which we're called as Christians and that posture of sometimes anachronism that we feel that the church sometimes displays when we're thinking about tech and digitizing things. And that's not to say we need to charge recklessly into any new piece of technology that we come across without thinking through the ethical, the faith, the physical ramifications of it. But we would just encourage us to tap into that posture of hope to which we're called as Christians. And as Shamika shared earlier, that spirit of fearlessness and of God's presence through some of the difficult questions and conversations. So we really put a lot of time and energy into this presentation, and we're really glad that you all were able to join us for it. So thank you so much. We have like 30 seconds for Q and R's. So I would love to check out some of those chats. Otherwise, the affinity group space that Shamika mentioned is something that we're really looking forward to as well. So if you're interested in this kind of conversation, I know there was a lot of questions we didn't get to yet.
Yes, and there's a lot of really great comments in the chat as well. But I just want to reiterate with what Kenji just said. We did have a blast putting this together and really appreciate your time and attention. And if you want to continue the conversation, you can join us in the affinity group that'll be starting shortly. Oh, there's a request to go back to the final thoughts slide for just a second. Yes.
Awesome. You guys finished on time. Thank you so much. I know that is always a victory in and of itself. So I like to highlight that. Thank you all so much for your thoughtful presentation. I am so glad that you all got to e-meet and really like dive into some deep stuff. It was what we needed to think about as a community, and not just about, you know, talking about when to post on Facebook, but allowing us to like experience the next level of deepening in our understanding of theology and ethics and religion, and how we interact with ourselves as citizens online, and what our religious duty is. So thank you so much. It was everything that I thought it could be and even more.